So I'll have Yuli start introducing. Yuli is the president and founder of Innovator MD, and he will introduce the the keynote speakers, and we will have 3 keynote speakers giving the presentation today. Go ahead, Yuli.
Thank you, Brajesh. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yuli Cheripalli. I'm glad that you joined our conversation today. So we are very excited today because we have some awesome speakers. The first one is going to be Dr. Deepak Behera. He's the president and CEO of Medical Imaging Consultancy. Dr. Deepak, go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction.
You have to share your screen. Yeah.
Yes, I'll share my screen in a second.
And to the audience, all the attendees, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. And then I try to unmute you when the question comes. For the keynote speaker, we'll have all 3 speakers present, and then we'll have networking and question session at the same time. So introduce yourself and ask your questions. And before that, put it in chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Brajesh. So today's keynote is clinical trials, challenges and opportunities. First of all, at the outset, gotta say I'm humbled by the presence of a lot of people with tremendous amount of experience and expertise in product development in various different ways, in helping the health care science, medical science, advance to the next level in many different ways, from software through pharmaceuticals, devices, ideas, consulting, everything all together. So we're going to move a little bit away from product and science to a little bit more of a systemic, social kind of a situation or problem or challenge, if you will, and try to see how something that probably hasn't been discussed on this forum yet, clinical trials. How can clinical trials be an opportunity, and what are the challenges with clinical trials, specifically geared towards patients and physicians? If we open up, if we say clinical trials and their challenges, they can be 100, 1,000 different challenges, but we'll keep that narrow. And so to address potential social inequities, if you will, in the population. So with that in mind, let's move on to the goals for this presentation today. Is to first of all define what's clinical trial, what are the goals and challenges in clinical trial, not really clinical trials as such, but participation, physician and patient participation in clinical trials. Then on the second part, so I'll be presenting the first part here, creating the problems statement, if you will. And then my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Andruska and Mr. Coulter, Brian Coulter, will present their perspective, because they have actually been the solution and they are looking to be the solution going forward as well. So they'll give us their perspective on what can physicians do, what can patients do, and how should you think about clinical trials, participating in clinical trials. So the goals of clinical trials participation, remember, I said not the goals for clinical trials themselves. Clinical trials have various different goals. They could be elucidating a scientific problem, taking care of a systemic issue. It could be looking at epidemiology and a new biomarker, any of those. So one of the goals is to advance medicine and science. But in this case, we're talking about participation. What are the goals for people who participate in clinical trials? Again, physicians and patients, and what are their goals? So it could be advancing medicine and science, just like everybody else. They can contribute to drug and device development. And one of the important things that is usually not being considered very often by clinical trialists is to give patients early access to therapies, in the sense that, can clinical trials be a patient care option? And we'll show you an example of that. Now, this is a graph that shows age-adjusted rate of cancer deaths per 100,000 patients. And as you can see, in rural areas, the cancer deaths are close to 180 and 158 in urban areas. There is a discrepancy here. While we all know that the incidence of cancer in urban areas is actually much larger than rural areas. Right? And there are many reasons for this. So the curious aspect is, but when given uniform access to cancer care through clinical trials, the rural and urban patients had similar outcomes. So clinical trials are able to reduce that difference between care. So can clinical trials be an option for patient care? Absolutely. In fact, we can pretty much say improving access to uniform treatment strategies may help resolve the disparity in outcomes. Right. Now, when we go and talk about challenges and opportunities today, I'm going to be talking about challenges from the perspective of the sponsors, of patients and physicians. So who are sponsors? Sponsors are people such as investigators, professors, scientists, or companies such as pharmaceutical companies and device companies, institutions such as the National Cancer Institute or Alzheimer's Association, or organizations such as, let's say the Bill Gates Foundation. These sponsors, they are sponsors because they oversee or pay for a clinical trial and collect and analyze the data to achieve a certain goal, right? Now, the challenges that sponsors face, again, in terms of, there are many challenges, but we'll focus on these few. 90% of clinical trials are delayed due to underperforming patient recruitment. Now, study timelines are typically extended to nearly double, even with those that complete patient enrollment. And about 37% of sites do not meet the enrollment targets. And what can be the consequences for sponsors? Okay. If a study is not able to reach its targeted population sample size, its targeted enrollment, the sample size is underpowered. So we are not able to conclusively say whether the trial is able to meet its objectives or not. Right? At the same time, because these studies are delayed, there is delay in obtaining FDA approval, thereby loss in revenue for many of the companies. There are increased costs that definitely associated with extended timelines, as we can all imagine. And in my opinion, something close to my heart is cutting edge drugs and technologies are unavailable to patients in need because of the delay in approval, because of the delay in, and because of failed clinical trials many times. So trials often fail to complete due to poor accrual and take a very long time to complete, generating less timely and less influential results, according to a Journal of National Cancer Institute survey. Now, having said that, we come to patients now. What do patients want? If we look at patients want to participate in clinical trials, but often have limited access to research opportunities. A Research America survey of US adults in 2017 found that more than 80% of patients are likely to participate in clinical trials if it is recommended by their doctor. However, in reality, less than 5% actually do. And why is that? Right? Now, there are many barriers to patient enrollment. And one of the article that I mentioned in Journal of National Cancer Institute article in 2019 elucidates these four barriers for patient enrollment. One of them is structural, in which case no trial is available, accessibility to clinical trials. The second is clinical, where the patient is deemed ineligible. Of course, you wouldn't enroll a breast cancer patient in a lung cancer trial. Sometimes physicians are overwhelmed and they are unable to offer the trial to the patient. And patients themselves, they have their own biases and and preferences, as well as logistical challenges, including financial and everything, in which case they may decline to participate. So there's a very small proportion of patients that eventually enroll. And the paper found that structural and clinical barriers make up to 77% of challenges to enrollment. So this trial is not offered near the patient's home. It's not always available close to the patient's home. It is not offered for the patient's disease, and the patient is ineligible to participate. Whereas the physician and patient barriers made up to 23% of the challenges. All right. And the trial, what do these include? These are trial is not offered or discussed with the patient because of time constraints, because of institutional constraints. There is a physician's lack of support for conducting clinical trials, or physician lacks support for conducting trials, such as research coordinators and qualified staff and many other people, as well as equipment and infrastructure that is necessary to conduct a trial. And physicians not adequately reimbursed for their time. There's declining Medicare commercial reimbursements, as well as sponsor contracts, which is one of the important things to keep in mind. If physicians are not reimbursed properly, they may not be incentivized sufficiently enough to enroll or spend time really on their clinical trial, which eventually leads to lower enrollments. Now, if we look at this graph here, this kind of depicts what we just saw: 56%, almost 55% no trial available, structural and clinical barriers, 21% patients ineligible, about 15% not enrolled because of the physician and patient decision-making, and finally, about 8% of them are really enrolled. One of the interesting points over here, by the way, is there is a significant discrepancy between academic and community center enrollment. So if you see, a large proportion, almost twice the number of patients, more than twice the number of patients were enrolled in academic centers than in community centers.
Deepak, time check, 1 minute.
Okay, so that's actually, okay. I thought we had 30 minutes now, the three of us.
Total, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So 85% of the patients are diagnosed and treated at local community-based clinical practices. So there is a big discrepancy here, and which kind of highlights the fact that a lot of patients are available in community centers and in community practices, but don't really have access to clinical trials. So I'm going to go through a little faster here. Physicians want to be clinical trial investigators, but often do not know how to. So for physicians, why would they want to participate in clinical trials? To give their patients the latest and best care, probably. Probably to contribute to future drugs and technologies, to advance medicine and science, to mitigate burnout. Maybe there are a lot of physicians, actually, I saw in the chat box today, who say, they want to do something else than clinical practice, or in addition to the clinical practice. So is this an option? Reputation, do you want to be authors? Recognition, would you like to be speakers? Revenue, additional revenue? Any of these sound appealing? Now, 80% or more than 80% of physicians are interested to be clinical trial investigators. However, only less than 15% actually ever get involved in clinical trials, and most of them are academic, again, highlighting the difference between academic and community center practices. What are the challenges to physician practices? Naturally, paperwork in clinical trials is humongous amount of paperwork. This is a very heavily regulated industry, so to navigate all those is important. Clinical trial related finance and budgeting, which is also really important to understand. If we don't understand, we could probably be basically less reimbursed and therefore not incentivized enough to perform well with clinical trials. Clinical trial expertise may lag in the physician and their staff. Research support staff, they may not have those. And business development, how do we get clinical trials into our clinics? So the challenges are, what we highlighted are from the sponsor's point of view, from a patient's point of view, and from the physician's point of view. There is a sweet spot at this point where the limited number of less than 5% of eligible patients enroll in a clinical trial because of this. And what we would like to see is that area grow And there is a big opportunity here for all three segments, sponsors, patients, and physicians, to collaborate and bring more and more clinical trials and make more clinical trials accessible to patients, as well as patients accessible to clinical trials. And I think community physicians can play a very big role in this. So with that, I will hand over the next part of the presentation to Brian Coulter and Dr. Andruska. And I'm going to stop sharing right here. Right, Brian?
Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome, Brian. Brian is the founder of the Neuroscience Research Institute. Take it away, Brian.
Great. Let's see if this this works here. Can you see my my screen there?
Yes.
Great. So, former CEO at the Parkinson's Institute and Clinical Center. We recently actually had to shut down because of COVID. But I am very passionate about research and patient care and enabling and helping physicians, community physicians, really kind of fill this gap. And so I'm looking at this from kind of a business side of the equation. I'm not a physician, I'm a business person by training, but I'm very passionate about this research and opportunities that we'll be sharing today. So from a physician's perspective, there's actually opportunity at every stage of the therapeutic pipeline. And really the solution lies with connecting that physician interest and the sponsor need. So I want to start with kind of a 50,000 foot level at the therapeutic pipeline, and what are the different opportunities that community physicians have in engaging in this process, depending on their level of interest and expertise. So along the 3-4 stages, discovery, preclinical, kind of looking at IND application, and then doing phase 1 through 4 trials, there are opportunities to engage at the research level, as a consultant along the way, and then finally engaging in actually conducting the clinical trials. And so on the research side of things, obviously providing access to clinical data to help researchers identify those early discovery opportunities, participating in investigator-initiated studies, and even sponsor-initiated studies. One of the things we've found is that there are kind of small to medium-sized pharmaceutical companies, for example, who don't have the staffing for wet bench labs or the epidemiological sort of support for that. So they would actually be willing to conduct or pay for studies to be conducted at a very, very early stage of the pipeline. As we move through with the various stages, the consulting really is where that comes in as an opportunity for physicians to step in, not only to help guide the sponsors through that process, but also to provide their clinical expertise and look at things like, for example, biomarker validations. It could be that the sponsor is maybe going after an unusual biomarker, or could be looking at a better, more efficient biomarker in that process. So engaging as a consultant at that particular phase is an opportunity for physicians to participate in this process. Obviously giving insight and support. The FDA loves to have opinions from KOLs in terms of how does a particular product or device, how's that going to be beneficial from a clinical perspective. And so there's opportunities there to consult in that stage of the process. And then finally, in stage 4, the actual trials, one of the things that we've seen is that there may be some great ideas from startup companies that have a product, but they don't fully understand the clinical ramifications of it. And so oftentimes there's opportunity to provide input into the protocol development to ensure that there's maybe a greater success from a clinical perspective with respect to the drug and the testing in the trials. And finally, at that last stage, which is really what we're talking about, is this emphasis on conducting the clinical trials. And as we look at that, the physicians can conduct trials in a variety of different levels, how engaged they want to be, how much time and maybe resources they have to dedicate to that, what degree of revenue they're interested in gaining from that participation. But they can participate at a couple levels, from just a simple referring subjects for the clinical trials. They can take on a role of a principal investigator or a sub-PI in a trial, and performing those clinical assessments. So again, a big picture look at multiple opportunities for community physicians to engage in this process. But I think that really the solution lies with connecting the physicians with the sponsors and bringing those parties together to create a successful product through the pipeline. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Andruska, and she's going to share a little bit from the physician perspective. She's MD, PhD by training, and she's going to provide a physician perspective on this process. Kristin?
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here, and it's so nice to see so many mentors and consultants and startup represented here today, and also noticing physician representation here in the chat box, and people saying they're interested in getting into clinical trials, or they're starting new practices and interested in growing their clinical trials. Whether it's COVID related or not, we're all in that same boat, and it's been great to see new innovation and change come out of this. So this schematic illustrates how we like to conceptualize a healthy clinical trials research portfolio. And this could apply to an individual physician, a department, or an institution. In the schematic, the order of operations is not necessarily important, but what is important is that each of these three columns represents an umbrella that we like to always be kind of cognizant of balancing within our research portfolio. So the first column represents the sponsor, and for some sites, most or all of your sponsors may be large pharmaceuticals, but especially in Silicon Valley and other areas that are rich in tech and rich in startups, we get approached a lot by young companies like just looking to break into the medical field, by growing and large biotech and pharmaceutical companies who want to run even single site or regional clinical trials. And this schematic too, by the way, is organized in order of kind of increasing time commitment for the physician. So as we're thinking about engagement and thinking about prioritizing resources, we're thinking about balancing our engagement commitments. So next column is the target of the clinical trial. This might be a clinical trial that is disease modifying, where especially in our field, in neurology and neurodegenerative disease, we're looking at kind of these potential curative or of course the holy grail is a cure, but we always like to think that a cure started early enough is a definitive cure, and a curative therapy started mid-disease is disease modifying or disease slowing. A lot of the trials that we get approached by, however, are symptomatic trials. They're looking at certain bothersome symptoms of the diseases we treat and looking just to maybe repurpose compounds, take orphan compounds or develop new compounds for symptomatic relief. And then lastly, we also have companies approach us looking at biomarkers, which might be neither symptomatic or disease modifying, but looking to identify pre-symptomatic individuals or aid in diagnosis for post-symptomatic. And then lastly, we always consider the phase of trial, because again, more time intensive trials are going to be, especially those phase 1B, phase 2 trials, less time intensive with the phase 3 and post-market surveillance. And then we also have our kind of device, biomarker, and non-drug trials, which are oftentimes exploratory or maybe en route to FDA approval. But having a portfolio that isn't too heavy in any one sponsor subtype, any one target subtype, or any one phase subtype really helps us to think about how we're managing our personal resources of time, our financial resources, and our personnel within the department. So next slide. And this slide really addresses efficiency in clinical trial execution. Again, that could be efficiency with time, money, resources of any kind. But it's meant to kind of highlight some of the differences between what we might consider an older or more traditional model of engagement between sponsors and physicians, or CROs and physicians, or between sponsors and practice groups. Some individuals, some groups may find a high touch approach personally satisfying, to be involved in every kind of level of execution of a clinical trial at their site. But for most people, it's a more inefficient model when the physician or the immediate site team is kind of solely responsible for budgeting, for contracts, for mining the EMR for eligible subjects, and then whether it falls on a CRC or a physician to do the informed consent process, data collection. We heard people speak earlier tonight about data analysis, data entry, EDC, and of course, startup and closeout activities. So, of course, we're all looking for a more efficient way to run clinical trials, not only for better management of our individual and institutional resources, but also to shorten that pipeline of bringing effective therapies to market.
And I think that Deepak really did a great job illustrating what some of the challenges were. And a couple of things that stick out to me with respect to the physicians not engaging. I think Kristin just elaborated on that with the challenges from a time and a labor perspective, and just kind of being overwhelmed with that. But I think there's an opportunity through physicians engaging in a collaborative network. It brings about some solutions to these problems that Deepak identified. I think the other thing for me that jumps out as well is the discrepancy in the community physician-based pool or enrollment of participants in studies versus the academic. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to tap into that. A collaborative network of community physicians can do that. And then lastly, that what struck me was the kind of the socioeconomic discrepancies. I've talked to many patients who said, "Gosh, Brian, I want to participate in a clinical trial, but I'm on the Monterey Peninsula, and there's really no trials that I can get to. How can you help me with that?" And so we look at ways of collaborating with local community physicians to engage them in this collaborative network and bring access to those diverse areas and diverse populations. And so kind of in the concluding point here is the solution potentially lies in this engagement with collaborative networks. And really that eliminates a lot of the paperwork and the barriers for physicians to participate in clinical trials. It gives physicians an opportunity to add an additional revenue stream to their practice. As we know that the medical reimbursement rates have been declining significantly over the last 10 to 15 years, and physicians are looking for opportunities to bring in additional revenue streams. We think that this is a great opportunity to do that, low barrier to entry, and it solves a lot of the problems that were identified earlier in our presentation. So again, multiple opportunities for community physicians to engage, whether it's at the pipeline stage, as you're thinking about the portfolio emphasis or the volume of trials to take on, and the execution approach. How does the physician want to engage? Is it on a one-on-one basis with the sponsors or through a collaborative network? Our position would be the ideal solution there is through a collaborative network, and be happy to talk and answer more questions for the rest of this presentation time. Again, if there's information you want to reach out to us, feel free to reach out to us via email, even afterwards, and we'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more about that. But I'll turn it back over for a Q&A session.
Thanks, Brian, Kristin, and Deepak.